More than 70 million people would eventually die, and the entire disaster began with a lie that seemed far too small to change the world. A small group of operatives stormed a radio station while pretending to be Polish soldiers. Their mission was not to fight a battle. Their mission was to create a story. They even left behind a body to support the evidence. Apparently, every successful lie needed witnesses, paperwork, and a very convincing ending. The real question is not whether the attack was fake. The real question is why millions of people were willing to believe it. Why would a man risk everything on a lie this dangerous? Why would anyone gamble an entire continent on a single story? Just 1 year earlier, nearly every gamble seemed to be working. Every crisis ended with another victory, and confidence inside Germany kept growing. But beneath the victories, the clock was already ticking. Success had bought time, but it had not solved the much larger problem ahead. Germany had already learned how disastrous a two-front war could become. The previous war had left scars that military leaders never completely forgot. Factories needed resources, industries needed raw materials, and every passing month created even more pressure. Time itself was becoming a strategic problem. To Hitler, the answer seemed to lie somewhere in the east. Unfortunately, one country stood directly between Germany and that goal. There was only one problem. Poland refused to move, refused to negotiate, and refused to disappear from the map. Unlike previous opponents, Poland showed no sign of backing down. The more pressure it received, the stronger its resistance appeared. For the first time in months, somebody simply said no, and suddenly the entire strategy began to slow down. The conflict was no longer about one city or one border. It was becoming a contest of pride, pressure, and political will. If Poland refused to bend, then something much larger was coming. The next decision would change the course of history. Hitler still believed pressure could solve the problem. If Poland would not agree voluntarily, perhaps fear would change its mind. Germany issued demands that seemed reasonable on paper, but behind those demands stood an army already preparing for something much larger. The city of Danzig became the center of the argument. One small place was suddenly carrying the weight of an entire continent. Poland refused to surrender control. Its leaders believed that giving up one demand would only invite the next. Britain watched the situation carefully. For the first time, Germany was facing opponents who were no longer willing to step aside.
The proposed terms are non-negotiable.
Europe had spent years avoiding another war. Ironically, that fear may have encouraged the next one. Promises were exchanged, guarantees were signed, and politicians continued talking. Meanwhile, military planners quietly prepared for the worst. Hitler expected Poland to back down just as others had done before. Instead, every new demand was answered with another refusal. The diplomatic crisis continued to grow. Each side believed the other would eventually blink first. Behind closed doors, military schedules became increasingly important. The calendar was beginning to matter more than the negotiations. Germany could not wait forever. Economic pressure, military planning, and political ambition were all moving faster than diplomacy. Every passing week made the situation more dangerous. Time was no longer reducing the crisis. Time was making it worse.
Diplomacy has failed.
For the first time, Hitler faced a problem that could not be solved through speeches or threats alone. The possibility of war was no longer distant. It was slowly becoming the most likely outcome.
Excellent.
And while Europe continued talking about peace, several people had already begun preparing for something very different. Poland had refused to move, Britain had refused to move, and suddenly Hitler found himself running out of options. Poland remained confident that its allies would support it. For the first time, Germany was facing an opponent that simply refused to step aside. Every diplomatic meeting seemed to end the same way. More discussions, more arguments, and absolutely no progress. Some officials still believed diplomacy could work. Others had already begun arguing that force would solve the problem much faster. Military preparations quietly accelerated behind the scenes. Orders were distributed long before the public understood what was happening. Officially, negotiations continued as usual. Unofficially, confidence in diplomacy was beginning to disappear. Time was becoming the most dangerous enemy. Every week that passed made the situation harder to control and easier to lose. If the Western path was blocked, perhaps the answer lay somewhere else. For the first time, Hitler began looking towards Stalin. If Poland would not move, Hitler needed a different solution. The problem was no longer Poland itself. The problem was time.
It must be the East.
The answer was unexpected. Stalin had spent years attacking Germany in speeches, yet politics often ignores yesterday's enemies.
Come.
Ribbentrop received a mission that would have sounded ridiculous only months earlier. Instead of traveling west, he was being sent east. The journey began immediately. Events were moving so quickly that diplomacy suddenly became a race against the calendar. As the delegation traveled east, very few people understood what was happening. Even many officials inside Germany remained confused. When Berlin's message reached Moscow, the response was far more positive than anyone expected. The Soviet leadership was willing to listen. Hitler and Stalin wanted the same thing. Neither trusted the other, but both wanted more time before a larger conflict. They also shared another interest. Both governments believed Eastern Europe could be rearranged to serve their own ambitions. Negotiations accelerated with surprising speed. Two governments that publicly hated each other suddenly discovered many common interests. Two enemies were now moving toward the same table, and Europe had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. On August 23, 1939, the impossible finally happened. Germany and the Soviet Union signed an agreement that shocked the entire world. For years, both governments had publicly described each other as enemies. Now their representatives sat together and signed documents side by side. Across Europe, politicians stared at the headlines in disbelief. The alliance nobody expected had suddenly become reality. Yesterday they were denouncing each other in speeches. Today they were smiling together for the cameras. But the public agreement was only part of the story. The most important details were never intended for newspapers or radio broadcasts. Behind closed doors, Eastern Europe was quietly divided on paper. Borders, territories, and entire populations became lines on a map. Hitler suddenly gained something priceless. He no longer feared fighting both East and West at the same time. For the first time in months, the pressure began to disappear. The nightmare of a two-front war finally seemed avoidable. Back in Germany, military preparations accelerated immediately. Plans that had once been uncertain now moved forward with confidence. The countdown to war had finally begun. The agreement had bought time, and Hitler intended to use every single day of it. Hitler now had military plans, political support, and time. The only thing he still needed was an excuse. The answer appeared near the border at a small radio station. It was an ordinary building that was about to become part of history.
This is our primary target.
A special operation was quietly organized behind closed doors. Only a small group of people knew what they were preparing. Their mission was surprisingly simple. They were not ordered to win a battle, they were ordered to create evidence. The operatives even dressed to look like Polish soldiers. Apparently, costumes were becoming an important part of international politics. The objective was never military victory. The objective was to create a story that newspapers and governments would believe.
People of Poland,
Facts were becoming
arise.
less important than
Operation is
appearances.
proceeding.
If the story looked
Operation
convincing,
is
the
proceeding.
truth would become much harder to find. On the evening of August 31st, the team moved toward the target. Everything had been prepared, and the clock was finally running. The radio station stood quietly in the darkness. Within a few hours, it would become one of the most famous buildings in modern history. The stage was ready, the actors were in position, and the performance was about to begin. The operation began exactly as planned. The men moved through the darkness knowing that an entire war might depend on what happened next. The radio station was seized within
Hands in the
minutes.
air.
The building offered almost no resistance, and the team quickly reached the broadcasting room.
Hands in the air.
A short message was transmitted over the air. It lasted only a few moments, but those few moments would echo across Europe. The broadcast claimed that Poland had attacked Germany. It was a simple story, and simple stories are often the easiest to believe. News of the incident spread faster than anyone could verify it. Rumors traveled far more quickly than facts. By the following morning, newspapers were already repeating the story. The version of events had been written before questions could even be asked. Hitler finally had the excuse he wanted. The incident provided exactly the justification he had been waiting for. On September 1st, German forces crossed the border. Tanks rolled forward, aircraft took to the skies, and the invasion began. Within hours, Europe realized that another war had started. What many feared for years had suddenly become reality. And it all began with a lie. A small radio station, a fabricated attack, and a story that millions of people accepted as truth. Within days, Europe was at war. What had begun as a regional crisis was rapidly becoming a conflict that would spread across the entire continent. Britain declared war on Germany after diplomacy finally collapsed. Years of compromise had reached their limit.
This is our only
France
option.
soon followed.
We must
The
proceed
conflict
with
that
caution.
Hitler hoped would remain local was already
all in
becoming much
agreement.
larger than expected. One country after another was drawn into the crisis. Alliances, treaties, and promises suddenly became real commitments. The lie had achieved exactly what it was designed to do. It provided the excuse, the justification, and the political cover. But lies have a dangerous habit. Once they begin moving, nobody can fully control where they end. Years later, entire cities would disappear, millions of families would be destroyed, and much of the world would be changed forever. More than 70 million people would eventually die, and it all began at a small radio station on a quiet night.